The barn had been leaning for 20 years, and on the morning of October 11th, 1986, it looked like it had finally made peace with the idea of falling. The east wall bowed outward, where a rotted beam had given up its post, and the light came through the gaps in the siding in long, dusty blades that cut across the folding tables and the cardboard boxes and the faces of the 24 buyers who had driven out along the quarry road before 8 in the morning to see what a dead man's life was worth on a Saturday. The Alderman Estate. That was what the hand-lettered signs at the county road had called it, taped to telephone poles in the dark the night before by the auctioneer's son. What it amounted to was 100 years of one family's accumulation laid out on plywood tables in a barn that smelled of old hay and iron-cold air-pressed glass pitchers, a set of encyclopedias with the spines gone soft, 3 wooden chairs, a butter churn, power tools from 3 different decades, a box of Reader's Digest, condensed books, a child's sled hanging from a nail, a mason jar full of wheat pennies, 2 oil paintings of landscapes no one recognized, a cast-iron skillet that could have anchored a small boat. People moved through it all with the particular silence of buyers who were thinking hard about money. They picked things up, turned them over, set them down. A woman in a barn coat pressed her thumbnail into the runners of the sled to test the wood. A man with a leather cap held the skillet by the handle and felt the weight of it, the way a man feels the weight of something he is trying to decide whether to love. At the far end of the room, beyond the last plywood table, a single object sat on the concrete floor by itself, as though the auctioneer had placed it there as an afterthought or a joke. An army footlocker. Olive drab, banded in riveted steel, scuffed to bare metal at every corner where the paint had given up. It was 26 inches long, 14 inches wide, the dimensions of every footlocker that had ever left an American depot in any war, a box built for practicality rather than permanence. The padlock through the hasp was a brass case lock, and whoever had last touched it had done so a long time ago. The shackle had frozen in the lock position, and rust had wept orange down the side of the steel box in long mineral stains that no one had thought to clean. The hasp itself had been painted over so many times that the original hardware was buried under 3 or 4 layers of paint. Each one a different decade's choice: olive green over gray, over brown, over green again. A sedimentary record of neglect. There was no key anywhere in the Alderman estate. The family had turned in a ring of keys to the auctioneer's table, and the auctioneer's son had tried every one of them against the padlock before the doors opened, and none of them fit. The consensus among the early arrivers was that the lock had probably been frozen shut longer than anyone in the room had been paying attention to it, and that whatever was inside the box was either worthless or inaccessible, which amounted to the same thing. Reed Calloway had made up his mind about it inside of 30 seconds. He was 34 years old, lean in the way of men who moved fast and ate between stops, with a zip vest over a flannel shirt and a pair of white sneakers that had no business being on a barn floor. He worked the county estate sales the way a fisherman works a river he knows well, always moving, always reading the water. His eye trained to spot the thing that was underpriced by someone who didn't know what they had. He carried a camera phone that he used to photograph items before he had even finished picking them up, because in the flipping business, the listing was sometimes more important than the object itself. He had driven 40 minutes from Carver County that morning on the strength of a tip from another picker, and by 8:15 he had already identified 3 items worth his time: the wheat pennies, the cast-iron skillet, and a brass surveying compass in a leather case that the auctioneer had buried in a box of miscellaneous hardware. The footlocker he dismissed the way a busy man dismisses something that offers only problems. A sealed box with no key was a liability, not an asset. You couldn't photograph the inside. You couldn't list it honestly. You couldn't price it without knowing what was in it. For a man who made his living on the quick turn, the certain flip the item you could move before the parking lot emptied. A locked box was the opposite of everything useful. He said so loudly to no one in particular, the way men who are used to being listened to will sometimes speak to a room rather than a person. That thing's not worth the concrete it's sitting on. Somebody welded a padlock onto a box of nothing and called it an estate. A few buyers near him smiled. One laughed outright. The auctioneer's son, who was 17 and wanted to be somewhere else, looked at his clipboard. The man who had been standing nearest the footlocker for the past 4 minutes did not smile, did not look up, did not acknowledge that anyone had spoken. Arthur Finn was 70 years old. He stood at 6 feet even straight as a man half his age, his spine carrying none of the forward lean that creeps into men who spend decades bent over workbenches. He was lean without being frail, weathered without being worn, the kind of man whose face told you he had spent his life outdoors in all seasons, but had never been surprised by any of them. Iron gray hair cut close and neat, a jaw that was clean-shaven and set level, eyes of a pale clear blue that caught the slant of morning light through the barn's gaps and held it without blinking. He wore a canvas barn coat the color of dried tobacco leaf waxed and well used over a green wool work shirt. On his left hand was a leather glove, and the right hand was bare because Arthur Finn had not survived 50 years of working with locks and keys and tumblers and springs by doing his reading through cloth. The bare hand was the kind of hand that told a story all by itself. The knuckles large, the fingers blunt at the tips, the nails clean and squared and worn into the skin of the right thumb, where it met the index finger, a faint, permanent groove that no amount of rest would ever fully close. It was the groove left by a lifetime of holding key blanks against a file, a groove that recorded in flesh what 50 years of skilled work records in nothing else. He had been standing near the footlocker for 4 minutes, but he had not been standing still. He had crouched down once at the level of the stenciled letters on the lid and spent a long moment very close to the paint. Then he had straightened, stood with both hands at his sides, and looked at the box the way a man looks at a thing he is trying to decide whether he has the right to touch. The auctioneer called the Footlocker lot at 9:40. He described it accurately and without enthusiasm. Olive drab Army footlocker, World War II era, padlocked, no key, present contents unknown. Starting bid $25. He looked out at the room. Nobody moved. He tried 15. Still nothing. The room had made its collective judgment unknown contents behind a frozen lock was a problem someone else could have. Reed Calloway from across the room pitched his voice to Carrie. "I wouldn't give you 5 for it. You can't even open it. Could be bricks in there. Could be absolutely nothing." A few people laughed. The auctioneer tried one more time. $20, anyone? $20 for a piece of American military history, contents unknown. Arthur Finn raised 2 fingers off the lid of the footlocker. A quiet gesture, barely a movement at all, more like a twitch than a bid. But the auctioneer saw it. $20, I have 20, do I hear? 30 him. Nobody heard 30. Nobody heard 25. The auctioneer, a practical man named Delbert Hogg, who had been running estate sales in 3 counties for 22 years, knocked the lot down at $20 to the quiet man in the barn coat. Reed Calloway's laugh was not cruel exactly. It was the laugh of a man who is so certain of his own reading of a situation that the contradiction of it strikes him as genuinely funny rather than threatening. He laughed the way people laugh at a punchline they saw coming from 3 sentences out. $20 for a box you can't even open. That's not an antique, friend. That's an expensive question. Several buyers turned to look because laughter in a room of quiet money always turns heads. A woman near the encyclopedias smiled uncertainly. A man in a canvas hat glanced over and then away. The auctioneer moved on to the next lot with the efficiency of a man paid by the hour. The only person in the barn who did not look at Reed Calloway was Arthur Finn. He reached into the inside pocket of his barn coat, produced a worn leather wallet, counted bills, into the auctioneer's clerk's hand, with the deliberate care of a man who has spent his whole life making sure of small things, and asked in a voice that required the clerk to lean forward, "Do you know anything about where this box came from? Whether it belonged to the Alderman family directly or came in from somewhere else?" The clerk, a woman of about 50 with reading glasses, pushed up on her forehead, checked her sheet. "Came from the attic, far as I know. Family said they didn't recognize it. Figured it was something old Walt Alderman picked up at a sale sometime in the 60s or 70s. Nobody here knew what was in it." Arthur thanked her with a nod and went to get his box. He carried it out to his truck himself. It weighed perhaps 40 pounds, which told him something, though not enough. He set it on a moving blanket in the bed of his Ford pickup, a truck the color of old pewter with 160,000 miles on it, and a replacement tailgate that didn't quite match, and he tied it down with 2 short lengths of bungee cord. Not because he was worried it would shift, because he was already beginning to treat it with a care it had not been shown in a very long time. Callan Pruitt had been watching from the barn door. He was 19 years old, with the particular build of a young man who does physical labor and hasn't yet fully grown into the width of his own shoulders. He had been helping the auctioneer haul and stack and carry since 6 that morning, and his jacket had a rip at the left elbow that he hadn't gotten around to patching. He had grown up on the same block as Arthur Finn's shop, 2 houses down from the corner of Main and Depot, close enough that the sound of Arthur's grinder had been part of the background noise of his entire childhood. A high, thin whine that he associated more with Saturday mornings than he associated with anything else. He had not laughed when Reed Calloway laughed. He had watched Arthur instead watch the careful way the old man had crouched near the lid, watched the stillness of him during the bidding, watched the two-finger raise that was so small it barely qualified as a gesture, and found himself feeling something he couldn't name precisely. Something between curiosity and a vague protectiveness, the feeling of watching someone do something that most of the room had decided was foolish without understanding why it wasn't. He followed Arthur out to the truck at a distance that made clear he was not following so much as walking in the same direction. Arthur had the tailgate up by the time Callan reached him. He was pressing his gloved left hand flat against the top of the footlocker, testing its stability on the moving blanket. "Mr. Finn?" Callan stopped a few feet back, hands in his jacket pockets. "How are you even going to get it open? That lock looks like it hasn't moved since the war." Arthur did not turn around immediately. He finished checking the bungee cord on the near side, then moved around to the far side to check the other, and then he straightened and looked at the box for a moment before he looked at Callan. His bare right hand came to rest on the lid of the footlocker. He set it flat, palm down, the way you might lay a hand on the shoulder of someone who has been carrying something alone for a very long time. He stood like that for a moment, the hand on the steel, the cold morning light coming pale over the quarry road, the sound of the estate sale going on without them inside the leaning barn. "A lock isn't a wall, son." His voice was even and unhurried, the voice of a man who had long since stopped seeing any reason to rush words. "It's a question. You just have to be patient enough to hear what it's asking." Callan looked at the box, then at the man, then at the box again. He didn't have an answer for that. He wasn't sure one was expected. Arthur pulled his leather glove back on, walked around to the driver's side, and got in. The truck started on the first turn of the key because Arthur Finn maintained his vehicles with the same philosophy he applied to everything else. Small, consistent attention was cheaper than emergency repair. He pulled out of the field and onto the quarry road, and the footlocker road in the back, tied down under a gray October sky, going home for the first time in a long time. Arthur Finn's shop occupied the ground floor corner of a 2-story brick building on Main Street at Depot, a location it had held since 1941, when his father had opened it as a general hardware operation, and Arthur, then 15, had learned the lock trade by watching and then by doing. The hardware half of the business had passed into other hands in the 1960s, but the lock and key shop had stayed, had outlasted 3 landlords and 2 recessions, and a stretch in the mid-70s when Main Street in Millhaven had looked like it might not survive the decade. The sign above the door was painted directly on the brick, "Finn's Lock and Key S10, 1941. The paint was old but legible, touched up every few years by Arthur himself, with a brush and a can of the closest color he could find to the original. Inside, the front room held a glass case with key blanks sorted by Type A board on the wall, with every padlock Arthur kept in stock hanging from labeled pegs, a wooden counter worn smooth at the edges, and a cash register from 1962 that still worked without complaint. The back room was where the real work happened. A long wooden bench ran the full length of the wall under 2 fluorescent lights, and a third light on a gooseneck arm that could be positioned close for fine work. On the bench, a key-cutting machine, 2 vices, a set of files in graduated sizes hung on the wall above, in order from coarsest to finest, a magnifying glass on a stand, a shallow steel tray for small parts, 3 cans of penetrating oil in various states of use, and a collection of pick tools in a leather roll that Arthur had made himself 30 years ago from a piece of saddle leather and still used most days of the week. He set the footlocker on the bench at 6:30 that evening, after the shop had been locked, and the front sign turned and stood looking at it for a few minutes before he touched it. The stenciled letters on the lid had once been white. Now they were the gray of old chalk on a board that had been erased and reused until the surface itself had gone soft. But Arthur had spent 50 years reading things that were not meant to be easily read, and he had read them under worse light than this. He set the gooseneck lamp close, angled the beam across the surface at a low angle, so the letters caught the light differently than the surrounding paint, and read what was there. Thomas Greer, PFC, U.S. Army. He stood with his hand on the lamp and did not move for a long time. The memory came the way memories always come to men in their 70s without warning, and with a completeness that younger people don't understand, not as a fragmented impression, but as a fully inhabited moment, the smell and the cold and the particular quality of light all returning as though the intervening years were simply a door that had swung shut and now swung open again. March of 1944, the Millhaven Depot. He had been 28 years old already running the lock shop alone because his father's hands had started to go, the joints swelling in the cold mornings until the fine work became impossible. He had walked to the depot that morning not because Thomas Greer was a close friend, not because they had grown up together or gone to school in the same class, or shared more than the ordinary acquaintance of men who lived in the same small town, but because in a town of 3,000 people, when a young man ships out to war, the town tends to come to the depot. Not out of ceremony exactly, or not only, out of the simple human instinct to bear witness to a departure that might be permanent. Thomas Greer had been 22 years old. He was the son of Edmund Greer, who had run the feed supply on River Street, and Mildred Greer, who taught the 3rd grade at Millhaven Elementary and was known for keeping a glass jar of peppermint sticks on her desk. Thomas was the youngest child and the only boy. His sisters were older, all married by then, and living in other counties, except the one who had stayed, the one Arthur remembered as a quiet, watchful woman who had stood at the depot that morning in a brown wool coat with her hands folded in front of her. Thomas himself had been easy to pick out of the small crowd of departing men, tall, wide-shouldered, with a face that had not yet settled into whatever it was going to look like for the rest of his life, still carrying in his jaw and his eyes the unfinished quality of a young man who had not quite arrived at himself yet. He had made a joke to someone near him while they waited, and there had been a round of laughter, the loose, brief laughter of men who are doing their best to be easy about something that is not easy at all. When the platform started to clear, and the men began moving toward the cars, Thomas Greer had turned once toward the small group of people who had come to see him off, and he had nodded. Not a wave, not a smile, just a nod, the gesture of a man acknowledging that he had been seen and that being seen mattered. Arthur had been at the back of the small crowd, and he was not certain the nod had been directed at him specifically or at the assembled group of them, but he had nodded back because it seemed like the right response to a thing that deserved acknowledgement. He had not thought about Thomas Greer very often in the 42 years since. The war had taken young men from Millhaven, the way it took them from every small town in the country, and most of them had come back, and the ones who hadn't had gradually become names on a stone in the park, rather than faces in a crowd, the way the dead inevitably do when the living have no choice but to continue living. Thomas Greer was on that stone. Arthur had walked past it 1,000 times without stopping, the way you walk past things that have become furniture. But he was not walking past now. He was standing in the back room of his shop at 6:30 on a Saturday evening in October with his hand still on the gooseneck lamp, looking at a man's name stenciled in faded white letters on the lid of a box that had ridden 41 years through strangers' hands and ended up on a barn floor. He thought about that nod, the unhurried acknowledgement of a 22-year-old man who was boarding a train to a war and taking the time in the last few seconds before he disappeared to make sure the people watching knew he had seen them watching. Then he went to get his tools. The padlock first. That was where you always started, because the padlock was the most recent obstacle and often the most solvable. And because the psychology of a lock thing was cumulative, you removed the problems one by one in the order you could reach them, not in the order they had been added. Arthur lifted the padlock in his bare right hand, turned it slowly in the light, and began his reading. It was a brass case lock military issue, the kind that had been standard equipment for footlockers of this era, a solid and well-made piece of hardware in its original state. The original state was a very long time ago. The brass had oxidized to a dull brown, and the iron shackle had rusted so thoroughly that the metal seemed almost to fuse with the body, as though the lock were trying to become a single solid object rather than a mechanism. Rust had also bled down through the hasp, staining the surrounding steel of the footlocker lid, with those orange mineral tears he had noticed in the barn. He set the padlock down, took one of the cans of penetrating oil from the shelf, and applied it carefully to the shackle and to every gap he could find in the housing. Not a flood, not a drench. A deliberate application to the specific places where the rust was holding the mechanism. Then he set a rag under the lock to catch the overflow, sat back on his stool, folded his hands in front of him, and waited. That was how Callan Pruitt found him when he knocked on the back door at 7:15. The young man had driven to the shop from the estate sale without exactly planning to. He had finished his work for the auctioneer by 4, collected his cash from Delbert Hogg, driven home, eaten something standing over the kitchen sink, and found himself thinking about the Footlocker and the old man in the barn coat in a way that didn't easily resolve. He told himself he was driving past anyway, which was not entirely true because the shop was 4 blocks out of his way home. The backlight was on. He knocked. Arthur crossed the room and opened the door without asking who it was, because a man who has run a ground-floor shop for 45 years develops a working faith in the ordinariness of visitors. Callan stepped in, looked at the bench, looked at the footlocker, looked at the oil-dark rag under the padlock. He didn't say anything for a moment. Arthur had already returned to his stool. He gestured at a second stool near the end of the bench, the wordless offer of a man who doesn't see any reason to make a production out of hospitality. Callan sat. He looked at the name on the lid of the footlocker under the gooseneck light. He read it. He looked at Arthur. Thomas Greer. He said it the way you say a name you've never seen before, testing the weight of it. Did you know him? Arthur reached for the padlock, turned it once in his hand, set it back down. I watched him leave. Callan waited. The shop was quiet in the particular way that shops are quiet. After hours, a silence that was different from emptiness. The silence of a room that knows what it was built for, even when no work is happening. March of 44. Arthur continued, his eyes on the padlock rather than on the young man. He shipped out from the Millhaven depot with a group of other men. I was there. Most of the town was there. A pause. He never came back. The word the family got was missing. Then nothing. Missing. Callan turned the word over. Like they never found him. Like the war ended and Thomas Greer was not in it anymore, and nobody ever brought him home. Arthur set the padlock down with a small, definitive sound. His footlocker apparently made it back without him. Callan looked at the box again, the faded stenciling, the rust, the painted-over hasp. He thought about what it meant for an object to outlast the person it belonged to by 41 years, to travel through strangers' attics and estate sales to end up on a concrete barn floor, with no one in the room willing to bid on it. Why didn't you say anything in the barn when that guy was laughing? Arthur considered the question as though it deserved genuine consideration rather than a quick deflection. Because a man who needs to explain himself to people who've already decided what they think is wasting time, he could spend working. He reached for the penetrating oil again, applied another careful line to the shackle joint, set the can back on its ring. Outside, the October dark had come down fully, and the light through the shop's small back window showed nothing but the reflection of the room itself. Reed Calloway had not thought about the footlocker since leaving the barn, which was consistent with his general philosophy that time spent on things that couldn't be moved wasn't time he had to offer. He had driven back to Carver County with the wheat pennies in a coffee can on the passenger seat, the compass in his vest pocket, the cast-iron skillet wrapped in a moving blanket in the back of his van. By noon, he had photographed all 3 against the white sheet he used as a backdrop, written the listings in the practiced language of a man who had learned to make ordinary things sound specific, posted them to the platform he used for flipping, and marked himself available for local pickup. By 2 in the afternoon, the compass had a buyer. By 4, the pennies had 3 people interested in a starting offer. The skillet was slower, but skillets always were. You had to find the right buyer who understood weight and provenance, and they always turned up eventually. He had no way of knowing that in the back room of a lock shop on the corner of Main and Depot in Millhaven, the question he had dismissed was being asked patiently, 1/4 degree at a time, by a man with a right thumb worn into a groove by 50 years of careful work under a gooseneck lamp in the company of a 19-year-old who was learning something he would not be able to name until much later. The padlock had been soaking for 9 days. Arthur turned it every evening, a precise quarter rotation applied to the shackle, not to force it, but to feel where the rust was giving and where it was holding. The rust of 4 decades was not uniform. It was geological, layered, the product of moisture and time, and the chemistry of old iron and old brass in close proximity, and it gave way in specific places before it gave way in others. Arthur mapped those places the way you map terrain by touch, by the resistance he felt at each degree of rotation, by the faint sound the mechanism made or didn't make when pressure was applied in a particular direction. Callan came by most evenings after his shift. He didn't always stay long. Sometimes he sat on the stool and watched for 30 minutes, then left without saying much. Sometimes he asked questions, and Arthur answered them in the way of a man who had never taken on an apprentice officially, but understood instinctively that understanding comes through questions asked in the right order. How do you know how much pressure to use? You don't push until you feel where it wants to go. Then you go a little before that. What if it doesn't want to go anywhere? Everything wants to go somewhere. You're waiting for it to tell you where. On the 11th evening, Arthur sat at the bench and looked at his right hand for a long time before picking up the padlock. The tremor was small, barely visible, but he felt it the way you feel something in your own body that you've been pretending wasn't there. His hand steadied when he set it flat on a surface, but in the air holding a small object, the fine tremor was present. He was 70 years old, and it had been there on and off for a year, and he had not told anyone. He picked up the padlock. His hand steadied around it, the weight of the object giving his muscles something to work against. He turned it once in the lamplight, located the place on the shackle joint where he had felt the most give on the previous 2 evenings, and applied the quarter rotation. Something moved. Not much. A fraction. But something that had not moved yesterday moved tonight. He set the lock down, leaned back on the stool, folded his hands in his lap, and allowed himself a single slow breath. He did not call it progress. He called it information. Progress implied a destination he was confident of reaching. Information implied only that the next question had been answered and that there were more questions still waiting. He thought about Thomas Greer, who had gone forward with his questions into a European spring in 1945 and had run out of the time required to hear the answers. He thought about the knot on the platform, the finished gesture of an unfinished life. He reached for the oil, applied it to the place where the mechanism had given, and turned the lamp off for the night. Callan arriving 20 minutes later to find the back door locked, and the light out, stood on the step for a moment in the cold, then walked back to his truck. He sat there for a moment looking at the brick building with its painted sign faintly visible in the dark. He thought about a locked box and a faded name, and a man who turned a padlock a quarter degree at a time and called it listening. He drove home in the October dark, and for the first time in a long time, he thought about what he was doing with his life in terms of whether it was the kind of thing that would matter to anyone in 41 years. Reed Calloway's listings were moving slower than usual. The skillet had sold finally at $3 under his asking price to a woman in Columbus who made him wait 4 days before confirming. The pennies had gone for a disappointing number because 3 other sellers had posted similar lots in the same week. The compass had been his best return, which was good, but one good item per sale didn't cover the overhead he was building. He had rented a storage unit in September to handle the overflow, a 10 by 20 space on the edge of town that he paid $200 a month to keep, and it was currently holding more inventory than he had sold in the past 6 weeks combined. The buy low, sell high equation, which had felt like a natural law when he'd started flipping 3 years earlier, was beginning to reveal itself as a thing that depended on conditions, not on cleverness, and the conditions were changing. More pickers were working the same county sales he worked. The app he used to sell was crowded with men exactly like him, which meant prices were compressing. Buyers had more choices, and the edge that speed and volume had once given him was no longer the edge it had been. He had borrowed to buy the van. He had borrowed for the storage unit's first 3 months. He had borrowed a little to cover a month when the listings moved slower than the bills arrived. He was not yet in trouble. He was in the position a man reaches before trouble, the position where the arithmetic still works if everything goes right, but the margin for things going wrong has reduced to something very thin and non-negotiable. He did not think about the Footlocker. Arthur did. Every evening after the shop closed and the front sign was turned, Arthur came to the back room, applied oil, applied the quarter rotation, listened to what the lock was telling him, and made a note in a small paper tablet of what he had found. The notes were technical, the degree at which resistance was highest, the degree at which it lessened the rate at which the oil was penetrating the estimated condition of the internal mechanism based on the external behavior of the shackle. They were the notes of a craftsman, not a journal recording observation, rather than feeling. But on the 14th night after he had put the padlock down and the notes away, he sat for a moment and looked at the name on the lid of the Footlocker and let himself think the thought he had been avoiding. He had not done anything for Thomas Greer when Thomas Greer could have used something done. He had not gone to the family after the word came. He had not visited the mother, had not sat with the sister in the brown wool coat, had not done the small civic things that a community does for its lost. He had meant to. He had thought about it. Something else had always required his attention first, And then time had passed the way time does until the absence of action had solidified into its own kind of permanent fact. 41 years was long enough to owe a man something. He reached over, set his hand flat on the lid of the footlocker one more time, and then stood up, turned off the gooseneck lamp, and went upstairs to his apartment above the shop. In the dark of the workroom, the footlocker sat on the bench, patient as the question it contained, waiting for the man who had promised nothing but was not going to stop. November came to Millhaven the way it always did, without ceremony, without the gradual dimming that September offered, or the theatrical last stand of October's color. It arrived overnight, a hard frost that killed what was left in the gardens on Depot Street, whitened the grass along the quarry road, turned the mud in the Alderman barn lot to something approaching concrete. The town pulled inward the way small towns do in the first cold, the way a hand closes around something worth keeping. Arthur Finn noticed the change in temperature only as it affected his work. Cold made old metal contract, which was sometimes useful, sometimes not, depending on the specific failure mode of the mechanism in question. The brass case lock on Thomas Greer's footlocker had been soaking in penetrating oil for 17 days by the time November arrived, and the cold introduced a new variable that Arthur had not originally calculated. The shackle, which had begun to show the faintest suggestion of movement, on day 14 stiffened again in the lower temperatures. Not back to where it had started, but back enough. He spent 3 evenings recalibrating. He brought a small space heater from the front room, positioned it under the bench to keep the metal from losing the ground. It had gained, then reduced the oil application to account for the changed viscosity in the warmer microclimate. He adjusted the rotation schedule, moving from a quarter turn to an eighth turn when the resistance told him the mechanism was working against him. He did this without frustration, because frustration required the belief that things should be moving faster than they were. And Arthur had spent 50 years arriving at the understanding that things moved at the speed their physics allowed, not at the speed human impatience preferred. What he did feel on the evening of the 18th day was something he would not have named to anyone who asked. He was seated on his stool with the padlock held up in the lamplight, applying the eighth turn with his bare right hand when the tremor returned more noticeably than before. His hand shook enough that the padlock shifted in his grip, and he had to set it down on the bench rather than risk dropping it. He set it down carefully, deliberately, as though the act of care could retroactively address the involuntary nature of what had just happened. He looked at his hand. He spread the fingers flat on the bench surface, watched them settle, watched the tremor fade as the hand found something solid to rest against. The hand was steady when it had a surface beneath it. It was only in the air in the holding, and the fine feeling where the steadiness abandoned him. He sat for a long moment with both hands flat on the bench, the padlock between them, the gooseneck lamp throwing its tight circle of light. He thought about the work he had done with these hands for 50 years, the thousands of locks opened, the keys cut by feel, the tumblers. He had read the way a musician reads a score through a combination of technical knowledge and something else that lived below the level of conscious technique. He thought about what it would mean for that capacity to diminish before this particular job was finished. Then he thought about Thomas Greer packing this box in the spring of 1944, pressing the lid down, turning the key in this same padlock when the brass was still bright. 41 years those hands had been gone. Everything they had ever been capable of doing was gone with them, except what they had sealed in here before they went. Arthur picked up the padlock again. His hand was not entirely steady, but it was steady enough. He applied the eighth turn to the place on the shackle joint where the resistance had most consistently yielded, and he listened. The listening was not metaphorical. Arthur Finn heard things in mechanisms that other people felt or saw or measured with instruments. It was not supernatural. It was the result of decades of attention concentrated on very small systems, the way any sustained attention eventually develops into a form of perception that operates below the threshold of deliberate thought. He heard the specific sound of rust giving way, different from the sound of metal failing, different from the sound of a spring that was no longer holding its tension. Callan arrived at 7:20, knocked twice in the rhythm he had established, let himself in when Arthur called out from the back room. He hung his jacket on the hook by the door, poured coffee from the pot. Arthur kept going on a hot plate in the corner and took his stool at the end of the bench. "Can I ask you something?" His coffee mug rested on his knee, not quite touching. Arthur looked up from the tablet. "Why not just drill it, the padlock? You could drill the shackle in 10 minutes, and then you'd at least know what was in there." Arthur put the pencil down. He turned to look at Callan with a directness that was not unfriendly, but was complete, the kind of look that preceded something worth hearing. Because drilling it tells the lock the only thing that matters to you is what's on the other side. A pause. And it tells the box you don't care what you break to get there. Callan considered this. But isn't the point what's on the other side? The point, Arthur said, is to bring back whatever's in there the way it was packed. You can't do that if you break the door on the way in. Callan turned his mug in his hands. What do you think is in there? Arthur looked at the name on the lid. I think someone packed that box the morning they left for the war, locked it with the intention of coming home to open it themselves, and never came home. He picked up the padlock again. I think whatever's in there has been waiting 41 years for someone to treat it right. Callan did not say anything for a while. The heater hummed under the bench. The oil on the shackle joint caught the lamplight in a faint dark gleam. I'll stay a little longer tonight if that's all right. Arthur didn't answer, which Callan had learned by now was a kind of yes. Across town on the same November evening, Reed Calloway was driving his van through a rain that hadn't been forecast on his way back from a sale in Portsmouth that had been worse than the drive. He had gone for a secretary desk listed as Victorian, which turned out to be a 1970s reproduction, a misidentification that had cost him 90 minutes of driving and 3 hours of standing in a cold garage. His phone had messages from a buyer in Wellsburg disputing the condition of a pressed glass pitcher Reed had described as excellent, and the storage unit which he passed on his way back through the edge of town was so full of unsold inventory that the door no longer opened all the way without resistance. He pulled into the storage facility, got out in the rain, opened the unit as far as it would go, stood looking at the stacked boxes, the wrapped furniture, the shelves of small items in labeled bins. He ran the arithmetic the way he had been running it more often in recent weeks. What was in here, what it had cost to acquire, what he could realistically expect to sell it for, how long that would take. The numbers were not new. He had done this calculation before. But something about standing in the rain in front of a unit that smelled of cardboard and wasted time made the numbers feel different from how they felt on a spreadsheet. He locked the unit, got back in the van, sat for a moment with the engine running. He put the van in gear and told himself he would think about the numbers tomorrow. Arthur cut his first key on the 23rd day. The keyway of the padlock had been cleaned over the course of the previous week, patiently using a pick tool no wider than a matchstick dipped in solvent, working the accumulated rust and debris out of the cylinder in layers. The keyway was now readable. Arthur had measured its profile with a set of calipers, cross-referenced the measurements against the military lock specifications he kept in a binder from a gunsmith's catalog he'd acquired in the 60s, selected the closest blank from his stock, mounted it in the vise, taken up his smallest file. The cutting of a key by hand without a code or a template was not guesswork. It was inference, the same activity as diagnosis, the same as reading. You knew the general family of the lock from its housing, the generation of its mechanism from its specifications, the probable bitting depth from the combination of era and manufacturer and wear pattern on the keyway. From that you produced not a certainty, but a highly educated first hypothesis, and then you tested it, noted where it stopped, adjusted, tried again. The first key he cut did not work. It entered the cylinder without binding, which told him the blank was correctly profiled, but failed to turn the cam because 2 of the bitting cuts were too shallow. He made a note, adjusted the file, cut the second key. The second key entered, cleanly turned, partway stopped. Better. He could feel where the remaining tumblers were not yet clearing their gates. He took the key back to the vise. Callan watched this with the focused attention of someone who understood from 4 weeks of evening visits that what he was watching was not repetitive failure, but iterative refinement, a distinction that required a particular way of looking at incremental work that most 19-year-olds had not yet developed. He was developing it. How many keys do you usually cut before one works? On a lock, I know. Arthur set the second key back in the vise. 2-3. On a lock I'm reading cold with 40 years of rust in the cylinder. He ran the file along the third bitting position. As many as it takes. He cut the third key that evening. It turned further than the second, caught on the last tumbler, stopped. He set it in the tray, labeled it with a penciled number, and put his tools away for the night. In the first week of November, Reed Calloway's storage unit was padlocked by the facility management over 2 months of unpaid fees. He received the notice by phone at 7 in the morning, standing in his kitchen in the kind of stillness that follows news you knew was possible, but spent considerable energy hoping wouldn't arrive. The facility would hold his contents for 30 days, after which unclaimed items would be subject to lien sale. He spent the morning on the phone with the bank with two buyers he'd been slow playing with his brother-in-law who lived in Columbus. The conversations were of the kind that strip the glossy surface off things, that require you to describe your situation plainly to people who are not inclined to soften their responses to it. By noon, he had a partial arrangement with the bank and an embarrassing conversation with his brother-in-law behind him, and he was sitting in the van outside the storage facility, looking at the padlock on his own unit. He had a thought he did not particularly want to have, which was that the man in the barn who had laughed at a locked box was now himself locked out of one. He did not stay with the thought long. He had too many practical problems to sit with ironic ones. But it was there, and it did not entirely leave. He drove past the corner of Main and Depot on his way to the bank. He did not know why he slowed. The shop was officially closed at that hour, the Finn's lock and key sign gray in the morning light, but a narrow line of brightness showed under the door to the workroom, visible through the alley beside the building. He sat at the corner for a moment. Through the alley, he could see that faint light. He thought about going in. He had no idea what he would say. He had even less of an idea why he thought the old man in there would have anything to offer him. The light changed. Reed drove on. Arthur had not looked up from his work. The fourth key fit. It happened on the 51st day, which was a Thursday in December, the first heavy frost of the month having come the night before. He had been at the bench since 5:30, unable to sleep past 4, in the way of men who have spent enough decades rising early that their bodies have stopped treating early as a choice. He had the bench heater running the gooseneck lamp on the coffee from the hot plate cooling in the mug he kept forgetting to drink. The fourth key entered the cylinder, engaged the first tumbler, the second the third. He felt the cam begin to rotate. His hand was steady in the way it was always steady when it had purpose. The key turned. The shackle released. He held the open padlock in his hand for a moment. A brass case lock, military issue circa 1942, manufactured to last, and then neglected for 4 decades, now open on a December Thursday morning in a lock shop in Millhaven, Ohio, held in the bare right hand of a man who had earned the right to hold it. He set it on the shelf above the bench where he kept solved problems. Then he covered the footlocker with a clean shop cloth, went to the front of the shop, turned on the overhead lights, unlocked the front door, and sat behind the counter to wait for the town to wake up. He had something to do before he opened that lid. He needed to know if there was someone still living who had a claim to what was inside, someone who was owed the contents of this box more than any archive or institution, someone for whom 41 years of not knowing was the primary fact of their adult life. He needed to know if Thomas Greer's sister was still alive. The Millhaven Public Library was 3 blocks from the shop. Edith Marsh had been its head librarian for nearly 30 years, a woman who had organized the institutional memory of a small town the way Arthur organized his key blanks by category, by era, by the specific nature of what you were looking for. Arthur arrived on a Monday morning before his shop opened and found her at the reference desk, sorting through a box of periodicals with the deliberate care of someone who respects the objects in her custody. He told her what he had. He told her the name on the lid, the dates, the history as he understood it. Thomas Greer, PFC, shipped from Millhaven in March 1944, missing in action in the spring of 1945. Body never recovered, family notified with the official language of a government that had run out of more specific words. He told her he had the footlocker, that he had gotten the lock open without breaking anything, that he had not yet opened the lid, that he needed to know whether there was family before he did. Edith listened to all of this without interrupting. Then she opened the cabinet below the reference desk, where she kept what she called the town's unofficial archive. The records that had never made it into any official repository, but that had accumulated in the library over decades. Church bulletins, school yearbooks, funeral programs, local newspaper clippings organized by family name in folders going back to the 1890s. She found the Greer folder in 4 minutes. She opened it on the desk between them. There were obituaries for Edmund Greer, 1961, for Mildred Greer, 1968. There was a church bulletin from 1947 with Thomas Greer's name among those commemorated on a Memorial Sunday. There was a newspaper notice from 1946, which was not quite an obituary because there was no confirmed death, only the official missing designation, and the phrase believed to have died in service. There was a single photograph, small and somewhat overexposed, showing a family group on the front steps of a house, all of them squinting into summer light. On the back in pencil, Greer family circa 1940. Edmund, Mildred, Harriet, Dorothy, Vera, Thomas. Edith turned back to the folder. There's a marriage notice. She found it Vera Elaine Greer married to Walter Dunmore, August 1950, Millhaven, First Methodist. Then deeper in the folder, a brief newspaper item from 1978, Walter Dunmore, obituary survived by his wife Vera Greer Dunmore, of Cedar Mill Road, Millhaven. Edith looked up. She would be 78 now. She crossed to her desk, consulted a directory binder, ran her finger down a column, stopped. Vera G. Dunmore, 44 Cedar Mill Road. Arthur stood with his hands folded in front of him on the reference desk, looking at that name. Vera Greer Dunmore, 78 years old, living 4 miles from the shop where her brother's Footlocker had been sitting on a bench for 53 days. She doesn't know, he said. It was not a question. Almost certainly not. Edith closed the binder. The box came out of the Alderman estate. Whoever brought it there wouldn't have known what was in it. Arthur stood quietly for a moment. He thought about Vera Greer Dunmore at 44 Cedar Mill Road, the sister in the brown wool coat on the depot platform in 1944, who had spent 4 decades carrying the word missing as the closest thing to an answer she had ever received. Don't call her, he said finally. Don't write, I'll go. Edith looked at him steadily. I'll come with you, when you're ready. He thanked her simply, without elaboration, and walked back to his shop in the December cold. That evening, he stood alone in the back room with the Footlocker on the bench. The hasp lifted the lock open, the lid closed by nothing but its own weight and gravity and 41 years of accumulated waiting. He worked the 2 remaining hasp screws free with the same care he had applied to everything else, refusing to strip the heads, refusing to crack the housing. The hasp came away. He set it on the bench. The lid rested against its hinges, held in place by nothing mechanical. He put both hands on the front edge of the lid, the left glove, the right bare, and raised it. It rose without resistance. The hinges, protected from moisture by the sealed box, moved with a smoothness that seemed almost incongruous after everything the exterior had endured. The lid came to its full open position with a soft sound, a release of air that had been inside since sometime in the spring of 1945, carrying with it the smell of old cloth, old paper, the specific mineral stillness of a space that had been kept rather than abandoned. Arthur held the lamp close to the opening. The contents had been packed with the care of a man who intended to reclaim them. Not stuffed, not thrown in, but placed each item given its position relative to the others, as though the arrangement itself was a form of statement. On top, wrapped in a square of oiled cloth that had kept its integrity through 4 decades, a journal. Small bound in brown leather, gone soft at the corners, a length of bootlace tied around it in a bow that was still intact. Beneath it, a short stack of black and white photographs held together with a rubber band that had long since hardened into brittleness. Below the photographs, a bundle of letters tied with cotton string, faded to the color of old bone. To the left of the letters, folded into a precise triangle, the way military families learned to fold such things, a section of cloth that had once been a flag. In the lower right corner, fitted into the space as though measured for it, a small flat box of the kind that held service medals. Arthur did not reach in immediately. He looked at the arrangement for a long time, reading it the way he read locks from the outside, in understanding the exterior before disturbing the interior. Thomas Greer had packed this box the morning he left. That was clear from the order of it, the top items being the ones he would have wanted most accessible when he came back. The journal first, because a man who kept a journal wanted to return to it the same way he wanted to return to himself. The oiled cloth protecting it was not a casual choice. That was a man who understood that his words might wait for him, who had made provision for the waiting without acknowledging that the waiting might be permanent. Arthur reached in with his right hand, the bare one, the one that had done all the reading. He lifted the journal out of the oiled cloth, held it in both hands, turned it once. The bootlace bow held. The leather was supple in the way that leather becomes when it has been cared for, and then sealed away in stable conditions. He set it on the bench beside the lamp without untying the bootlace. That was not his to open first. He lifted the photographs next, worked the hardened rubber band off with care so it didn't crack and scatter, spread the photographs on the bench under the lamp. There were 11 of them. Young men in uniform in the various casual poses of soldiers at rest, leaning against vehicles, squinting into hard European sun, grouped in front of structures Arthur couldn't identify. Thomas Greer appeared in 7 of the 11. He was recognizable immediately, same not quite settled quality as the young man on the platform, but in these photographs, he was grinning. The grin was the thing. A wide, unguarded, fully committed expression of a man who found the specific absurdity of his situation genuinely funny and was not embarrassed to show it. Arthur looked at that grin for a long time. He looked at it the way you look at evidence of a person's actual character that no posed portrait could have shown. This man had found things funny right up until he didn't find anything anymore, had carried his humor into whatever that final spring had brought him. The bundle of letters came next. Arthur untied the string, eased it off without breaking it, spread the bundle on the bench. 14 letters. The envelopes were addressed in the same hand, a round, careful script that was controlled without being stiff. The return addresses were military postal, the unit designations redacted in the manner of wartime correspondence. Each envelope had been opened carefully, the flap lifted rather than torn. He went through the envelopes one by one, reading only the exteriors until he found the one that was different. It was at the bottom of the stack, different in two specific ways. The envelope had not been sealed. The flap was tucked in rather than gummed down, the correspondence inside not yet committed to sending. There was no stamp. The address on the front was civilian, written in the same round hand, Miss Vera Greer, 14 Cedar Mill Road, Millhaven, Ohio. Arthur held the envelope in both hands. He did not open it. Not here, not alone. This was not his letter to read first. He set it carefully to one side, separate from the others. The metal box opened with a small brass catch. Inside, on a bed of fabric that had once been blue velvet, a bronze star on its ribbon, the metal tarnished to a dark amber, but the relief detail of the star still crisp. Beside it, on a short length of beaded chain, two metal dog tags. The stamped letters read, Greer Thomas W., the serial number below the name, the blood type, the religious designation, all of it pressed into the metal with the indifferent thoroughness of a military bureaucracy that understood that identity in the field needed to be legible under conditions that did not allow for nuance. Arthur held the dog tags in his palm for a moment, the chain pooled around them. Thomas Greer's name pressed into metal, carried in a footlocker through 41 years of strangers' attics. He set them back in the box, closed the catch. He sat on the stool with all of it spread on the bench before him, in the cone of the gooseneck lamp in the early December evening, in the silence of a shop that had given its whole working day to other people's problems, and now after hours held this one. Some locks open all the way. Some open only far enough to let you see what's inside without letting you reach the bottom. This one had opened far enough. What was inside was enough for the person who needed it, even if it could not answer the question the box most seemed to want answered, which was the question of what road or what cold week in a German spring had taken Thomas Greer away before the war finished without him. He put the journal, the photographs, the letters, the flag, the metal box with the dog tags back into the footlocker in the order he had found them, laid the oil cloth over the journal, closed the lid. He did not replace any lock. There was a new one to be made, a new key to cut, but that was work for later after the box had gone where it belonged. He went upstairs, made coffee, sat at his kitchen table in the December quiet. When Callan came by the following evening, Arthur met him at the back door and said only, "It's open, come in." The young man crossed the room to the bench, looked at the footlocker with its lid raised, looked at the contents spread carefully in the lamp's light, where Arthur had arranged them again. He stood looking for a long time without speaking. Arthur, from his stool, watched the young man's face do the thing that faces do when they encounter evidence of a life they had not previously considered real. The photographs got Callan first. The grin in 7 consecutive shots, the unguarded pleasure of a man who had not yet run out of things to find funny. Callan picked up one photograph, looked at it, set it back with the care of a person who understands midway through the act that what he is holding belongs to someone. "He looks like somebody you'd know," Callan said, his voice slightly lower than his usual register. He was. Arthur reached forward, moved the unsent letter to where Callan could see the address on the front. That one was never sent. He meant to deliver it himself. Callan read the address. His face went through something heavier than what the photographs had produced. Vera Greer Dunmore, Cedar Mill Road. He looked up. "She's 4 miles from here." "I know. Does she know the box exists?" "She knows her brother shipped out in the spring of 44. She knows the word that came back was missing." Arthur folded his hands on the bench. "She's been knowing that for 41 years. The following Sunday morning was the 8th of January, 1987. Arthur had called Edith Marsh on the Thursday prior briefly to tell her what the Footlocker had contained, to ask whether she would be willing to come with him to Cedar Mill Road. Not to lead, not to speak for him, but to be present the way the presence of a person who has spent 30 years being a repository of a town's memory sometimes matters in a moment that is adding to that memory. Edith had said yes without equivocation, which Arthur had expected. He loaded the Footlocker into the bed of his truck that Sunday morning with the same moving blanket he had used in October, tied it with the same bungee cords. The new padlock was not yet made. The lid was held closed by the weight of itself. He drove to Edith's apartment building on Sycamore. She came down in her coat, with her braid over one shoulder, got in without ceremony. They drove south on Main, turned onto the county road, followed Cedar Mill Road to its third curve. The house was white clapboard, 2 stories of porch, running the full front width, with a wooden railing that had been painted and repainted over the years until the paint layers at the rail's top edge had built up into something almost sculptural. The yard was winter bare, a large oak to the left of the house, with branches that made a specific pattern against the gray January sky. There was a light on in the front room. Arthur carried the Footlocker up the porch steps himself. Edith came behind him, said nothing. He set the Footlocker down in front of the door, straightened, knocked twice with his bare right hand. The woman who opened the door was 78 years old, 5 feet 4 inches, with white hair cut short, and the kind of face that had been handsome in its structure for so long that age had worked with it rather than against it, deepening the lines without diminishing the underlying geometry. She wore a dark blue house dress under a cardigan the color of oatmeal. Her eyes were gray-green clear, carrying in them the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent decades watching for something they were not sure would come. She looked at Arthur. She looked at Edith. She looked down at the olive drab box on her porch with the faded stenciling on the lid. She went very still. Arthur gave her the moment. He had learned in 50 years of returning things to people who had lost them that the first moment of recognition required space, that moving into it too quickly was a form of interference. He stood with his hands at his sides, his barn coat open to the January cold, and waited. Vera Greer Dunmore raised her eyes from the box to his face. Her voice, when she found it, was steadier than Arthur had expected, the voice of a woman who had been practicing steadiness for 4 decades. "Where did you find it?" "An estate sale in October, out on the quarry road." He paused. "It had been locked. It took me some time to open it." Her gaze moved back to the Footlocker, to the letters on the lid, Thomas Greer, PFCUS Army. Her right hand came up to the doorframe, not for support, exactly, more the way a person reaches for something solid when the ground beneath them is shifting. "You opened it without breaking it." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him again, this time with the full directness of a woman deciding something about a man in real time. Whatever she decided, she stepped back from the doorway. "Then you'd better bring it in." The front room was the room of a woman who had lived alone for many years but had not surrendered to it. The furniture positioned as though company were expected, a reading chair by the window, with good light bookshelves along the inner wall. A braided rug on the hardwood floor in colors that had faded to something richer than their original shades. On the mantel, a framed photograph, the formal portrait from 1944. Thomas Greer in his uniform. It had been there for 41 years. Vera had been looking at it every morning for 41 years. Arthur set the Footlocker on the braided rug. He opened the lid, stepped back. He did not announce the contents. He did not guide her through them. He moved to the side of the room and folded his hands and let Vera Greer Dunmore look into the box her brother had packed the morning he left and meet whatever was inside on her own terms. She lowered herself to her knees on the braided rug, which she did with the careful deliberateness of a 78-year-old body that has made its accommodations with gravity. She looked into the open box for a long time without touching anything. Then she reached in with both hands, the way you reach for something you are not entirely sure you are permitted to touch, and lifted out the journal. She held it for a moment, both hands around it, the bootlace bow still intact after 41 years. She turned it so the light from the side table lamp caught the cover. She untied the bow with fingers that were steady in the way that hands can be steady when the rest of a person is holding very still. She opened the journal to the first page. Thomas Greer's handwriting ran line after line across the page in the round, controlled script of a man who had been taught penmanship and had kept the habit. Vera looked at it. She looked at it the way you look at something you have been trying to remember the exact shape of for so long that seeing the real thing is almost more than the memory prepared you for. Her right hand came up flat and pressed itself over her mouth. She stayed like that for a long time, kneeling on the braided rug, the journal open in her left hand, her right hand over her mouth not moving. Arthur did not speak. Edith by the window did not speak. Finally, Vera lowered her right hand to the open page, pressed it flat there. The gesture of a person making contact with something that has been out of reach for longer than should be asked of anyone. That's Tommy's hand. Her voice was barely above the level of the room's natural quiet, the voice of a woman speaking something so private it had not been intended as speech at all. He used to read to me at the kitchen table every Sunday morning, before church. He'd read whatever he'd written that week, whether it was any good or not. Her thumb moved along the edge of the open page. I'd know it anywhere. She was silent for a moment. Then she looked up at Arthur, the gray-green eyes clear despite everything. All these years. The words came out level, not broken, the statement of a fact that had been lived with so long it had moved past the stage where it destroyed you each time you said it. We never got him back. Arthur looked at the woman kneeling on the braided rug with her brother's journal open in her hands. He looked at the formal portrait on the mantel, at the young man in uniform who had been watching from that frame over this room for 4 decades, while the room aged around him without him. He was close by the whole time. His voice carried no more volume than necessary. He just needed someone patient enough to open the door. Vera held his gaze for a moment, then looked back down at the journal. She turned the pages, slowly reading in the particular silence of a person absorbing something they cannot read quickly, because each line is arriving with the weight of what it proves: that the person was real, that the voice was real, that the absence is specific rather than abstract. She read for a long time. Neither Arthur nor Edith moved. When Vera reached the last written pages, she stopped. The final entry was dated April 3rd, 1945. She read it without speaking its contents aloud. Her face changed in a way that Arthur observed without trying to interpret the face of a woman receiving the last words her brother had written before the spring took him. She set the journal down on her knee, reached back into the footlocker, found the photographs, worked the hardened rubber band off carefully, spread them on the rug in front of her. She went through them one by one, and when she reached the first one showing Thomas's grin, the wide, unguarded expression of a man who found things funny, she stopped. There it is. Something shifted in her voice. A recognition so deep it was almost grief, but wasn't quite. It was the thing on the other side of grief, the thing you reach after 41 years of the other thing. He made that face at the dinner table every time he thought he'd gotten away with something. She went through the rest of the photographs. She touched each one briefly, the way you touch things you are making sure are real. Then she found the bundle of letters, eased the string off, went through the envelopes. She paused at the one near the bottom, the one with the address in Thomas's hand, her name on the front, the flap untucked, the stamp missing. She turned it over, turned it back. Her voice when she spoke was very careful, the voice of a person proceeding gently into territory they suspect might not hold their full weight. He wrote to me. He didn't send it. Arthur's voice was as even as he could keep it. I think he meant to bring it home. Vera looked at the envelope for a long time. Then she looked at Arthur. Will you read it? He had not expected this. He looked at her to make sure of what was being asked, not because she couldn't read it herself, but because she wanted the words spoken aloud in this room, wanted the letter to arrive the way Thomas had intended it to arrive, as spoken words delivered in person, voice filling the air of the house where she had waited. Arthur reached out, took the envelope from her hands. He removed the single-folded page, opened it, held it under the lamp Edith had turned to better angle. He read it. Thomas Greer had written to his sister in the same round hand that filled the journal. The handwriting of a man writing quickly but with care, the letters formed with the confidence of someone who had been writing to this person his whole life. He wrote that the push was almost finished. He wrote that the end was close enough that he could feel the geometry of it changing the way you can feel the last miles of a long road, even before you see the turn. He wrote that he had been thinking about the kitchen table on Sunday mornings, about the particular sound the coffee percolator made in the early quiet before the house woke up. He wrote that he had a list of things he intended to eat when he got home, specific dishes, specific combinations, the specific appetite of a man who has been living on army food for 2 years. He wrote that he was coming home before the corn was high. He was certain of it, one more push and the thing was finished. He wrote that she should not worry. He wrote that he had always come back from everything, and this was going to be one more thing he came back from. He had signed it, your brother Tommy. Arthur folded the letter, returned it to the envelope, placed it on the rug beside Vera's knee. The room was absolutely quiet. Vera sat with both hands in her lap, the journal on one knee, the envelope on the rug before her. She did not cry. This was not a room for crying, not because crying would have been wrong, but because what was happening in it was past the particular register where tears were the appropriate instrument. What was in the room was something older than grief, the specific gravity of a thing that has been waited for so long that its arrival is not relief, but recognition. After a long time, she said, "He really was coming home." Arthur did not answer because the statement did not require an answer. It required witness. He stood in the room and witnessed it. What followed happened in the way that things happen in small towns, not all at once, but by a steady accumulation of individual moments that together add up to a change in what a community knows about itself. Edith Marsh began the formal work, the library's work, the work of making the informal permanent. She contacted the Millhaven Historical Society, spoke with its director, a methodical man named Harold Sutter, who understood that the society's function was precisely to receive things like this. Vera, with Arthur's counsel, decided that Thomas's dog tags, the Bronze Star, the photographs, the formal portrait from the mantel she had kept for 41 years, would go to the society's collection. The journal she kept, the letters she kept, the flag she kept already in its triangle, the unsent letter she kept in the envelope, as it was the flap tucked in undelivered for 41 years and now delivered in the only way available. Harold Sutter prepared a case in the front room of the Historical Society on Fletcher Street, glass-fronted, positioned beside the east window so that the morning light came through at an angle that caught the metal of the dog tags, the Bronze Star on its ribbon, the photographs, 4 of them, the 4 that showed Thomas's grin most clearly, the formal portrait from 1944, a small typed card giving the relevant facts: Thomas William Greer, Private First Class U.S. Army, born Millhaven, Ohio, 1922, shipped March 1944. Missing in action, Germany, April 1945. Remains never recovered. Below the typed facts, a second line that Harold Sutter had added after speaking with Arthur: returned to his family by Arthur Finn Millhaven, January 1987. The news moved through Millhaven the way news moves in a place of that size, person to person, at the hardware store after church, over the counter at the diner on Main. People who had grown up knowing the Greer name as a name on a stone in the park came to the Historical Society and stood in front of the glass case. A few of the older ones, people in their 70s and 80s, remembered Thomas Greer as a living person, rather than a name, remembered him from the feed supply from school, from the depot in the spring of 1944. One woman, 91 years old, told Edith that she remembered Thomas bringing her mother a paper bag of seed corn when her father was ill one winter, that he had come to the back door with it and left before they could thank him. The act of a young man who had been raised to believe that generosity worked best when it was not witnessed. Reed Calloway came into the Historical Society on a Thursday afternoon in late January. He had not planned to, or had not acknowledged to himself that he had planned to. He was in Millhaven for a sale that had turned out to have nothing worth buying, and he had walked down Fletcher Street on the way back to the rental car, and the Historical Society's front window had a light in it. He went in because the door was unlocked. Harold Sutter was in the back room doing something with filing. The front room was empty. Reed stood in the middle of it, looked around, found the new case by the east window. He walked over to it, stood in front of the glass. He looked at the dog tags, at the Bronze Star, at the photographs, 4 of them, the 4 with the grin. He read the type card slowly, the way a man reads something he is making himself read rather than skimming. Thomas William Greer, 1922, March 1944. Germany, April 1945. Never recovered. He read the second line. Returned to his family by Arthur Finn Millhaven, January 1987. He stood in front of the glass for a long time. Long enough that Harold Sutter came out from the back room, saw him there, said nothing, went back. Long enough that the afternoon light through the east window shifted its angle, and the dog tags caught it differently. Reed Calloway had spent 3 years in the business of moving other people's things as fast as possible from the place they were to the place they could be sold. He had built a practice on the conviction that speed was the variable that mattered, that the man who moved fastest between acquisition and sale was the man who won, that the item's history was a story for the buyer's listing description rather than a thing to carry with you. He had laughed at a man in a barn coat in October for buying a locked box at a sale, And he had been right technically in the narrow accounting of it. The box had not been flippable, had not been photographable, had not been listable. He stood in front of the glass case in the Millhaven Historical Society and understood, without anyone telling him, that the narrow accounting had missed the entire point by a margin so large it wasn't even the same conversation. He left without speaking to Harold Sutter, walked back to the rental car, sat in it for a while. He did not go to the shop on Main and Depot. He did not knock on that door, did not offer the words that would have completed some circular narrative about the man who laughed at the auction. He was not sure he had the words, and he was less sure he had earned the right to use them. What he had was the thing in front of the glass case, the specific weight of it, which he was going to have to carry now that he had picked it up. He drove back to Carver County. The legal pad with its 2 numbers was on his kitchen table when he got home. He looked at it for the first time without putting his hand over one of the numbers. Arthur made the new padlock key in the first week of February. Brass cut from a blank he selected with care from the case in the front room, the specific weight of the metal right in his hand before he had done anything to it. He cut it on the machine, finished it by hand on the bench, tested it in the new padlock he had fitted to the Footlocker's hasp. The key turned with the clean authority of something made correctly, no resistance, no adjustment required. He drove out to Cedar Mill Road on a Saturday morning, the Footlocker in the truck bed, as before, the new padlock in his coat pocket. Vera answered the door before he knocked, which meant she had been watching for him, which he noted without comment. He came up the steps, set the Footlocker down on the porch, fitted the new padlock, through the hasp, closed it. He took the key from his pocket, held it out. Vera looked at the key in his open palm, then at him. He closed her fingers around it, both hands around hers for a moment, the way you close a thing that should stay closed, so it never has to be forced again. She looked at the key in her closed hand. The morning light was on the porch, winter light, pale but definite. The kind of light that makes things look exactly as they are, rather than better or worse. She held the key the way you hold something you have been given the permanent custody of. On the first working Monday of February, Callan Pruitt arrived at the shop before Arthur had come downstairs. He had a paper bag with 2 coffees from the diner on Main, which was a thing he had never done before. He set them on the counter, went to the back room, stood for a moment in front of the empty space on the bench where the Footlocker had been. When Arthur came down, Callan handed him one of the coffees without ceremony. Arthur took it. They stood in the front room with their coffees in the morning quiet of a shop not yet open. What happens now? Callan looked out the window at Main Street at the corner sign at the brick and the old painted letters. Arthur drank his coffee, considered the question with the care it deserved, the question of a 19-year-old standing at the beginning of something he couldn't yet see the shape of. Now you learn the rest of it. There are more locked things in this county than I can get to in the time I have left. Callan turned from the window, looked at the shop, at the key, blanks in the case, the padlocks on the board, the worn counter, the door to the back room where the bench waited with the tools in their places. He looked at it the way a person looks at a thing they are deciding whether to take on. He had been deciding since October. All right, he said. Nothing else. The 2 words carried what they needed to carry. The sign above the door on the corner of Main and Depot read Finn's Lock and Key, established 1941. It would go on reading that. The painted letters would need touching up in the spring, the way they needed touching up every few years, and Arthur would climb the short ladder with his brush and his closest match paint can and do it, or he would ask Callan to do it, or eventually Callan would do it without being asked, because it was his shop by then. The work itself did not change. Locks asked questions, and the shop answered them one at a time with whatever tools the problem required. In the Millhaven Historical Society on Fletcher Street, on a bright February morning, with the east window catching the first real light since November, a woman named Donna Krebs stopped in front of the glass case on her way through to the reading room. She was 34 years old, a teacher at the elementary school, had moved to Millhaven 4 years ago from Columbus. She had no personal connection to the name on the card, no memory of a man on a platform, or a family on Cedar Mill Road, or an October estate sale in a leaning barn. She read the card. She looked at the photographs before showing the grin. She read the card again slower, including the second line. She stood there for a while. On Cedar Mill Road, the Footlocker sat at the foot of the bed, in the room that had always been Thomas's room. The bed Mildred Greer had kept made for 41 years, and Vera had kept made since. The new padlock on the hasp was brass bright and well fitted. The key for it hung on a small hook beside the door, where Vera had put it the morning Arthur brought it within reach, always available, never hidden. The room had waited a long time. It was still waiting in the way rooms wait when the person they belong to has not come back, a specific quality of readiness that does not diminish with the passing of seasons. But the footlocker at the foot of the bed had changed the quality of the waiting. It was no longer the waiting of total absence. There was something of Thomas in the room now that had not been there before. Not the man himself that remained unresolved, would perhaps always remain unresolved, but the record of him, the round handwriting running line after line through the journal, the grin in 7 photographs, the plans in the unsent letter, the proof that he had been fully himself right up until the moment he wasn't. Some distances cannot be closed. Some questions open only far enough to let in a specific amount of light. The light that came in through the gap in this one was the light of a young man who had planned to come home, who had packed his box with care against his return, who had written a letter he intended to deliver by hand, who had grinned into hard sun in the last spring of the war with the full unguarded conviction that there was more to come. That was not nothing. That was for a woman who had spent 41 years with the word missing as the last word in her brother's story, very nearly everything. Arthur Finn drove back from Cedar Mill Road on that February morning through the bare fields, the winter light flat across the brown ground. He drove with both hands on the wheel, his right hand showing its faint tremor at the top of the arc, steadying at the grip. He had made the key from the right metal. He had cut it correctly. He had fitted the lock. These were small things, craftsman's things, the kind of things that do not require acknowledgement because they are only what the work required. He turned onto Main Street, drove the 4 blocks to the corner of Depot, pulled into the small lot beside the shop. Callan's truck was already there. Through the front window, he could see the young man moving behind the counter serving a customer, the first of the day. Arthur sat in the truck for a moment. The morning was cold, but the sun was on the brick of the building, warming the old painted letters above the door. He had opened over the course of his working life more things than he had ever counted. Locked safes, strong boxes. The accumulated sealed concerns of a county full of people who had lost their keys or outlived their keepers or simply found themselves standing in front of something important that would not open. Each one had been a question. Each one had required the same instrument, not the pick, not the file, not the penetrating oil, though all of those were necessary. The instrument was time applied without resentment. The instrument was attention that did not require a result by any particular hour. The instrument was the willingness to hear what a lock was asking before deciding what to tell it. He got out of the truck, went inside, hung his barn coat on the hook behind the counter. Callan was finishing with the customer, a middle-aged man who needed a copy of a car key. Arthur moved to the back room, turned on the bench light, looked at the tools in their places. There was more work waiting. There was always more work waiting. That was not a burden. That was the only kind of abundance that had ever made sense to him, the kind that required you to show up for it every day with your hands ready. He put on his work glove, picked up the first job of the morning, turned it in the light, and began to read.